Hey there, it's Super Dave. Welcome to Progwarts. I am here today to talk to you a little bit about the best albums for beginners to get into progressive rock. You want to be a prog noggin, you say? You want to get into progressive rock, but you don't know where to start? I'm going to help to provide you a little bit of guidance. I'm going to give you some suggestions of what I think are the best albums among the classic era, which pretty much is late 60s, early, mid 70s, maybe late 70s, but I don't think we go that far. That's the period you want to start with. And that's actually, if you want to get into prog rock period, that's kind of where I suggest you start, because that is the foundation for everything that came after. Those are the godfathers of it. They are the ones that started it all. And these are albums that I am selecting largely for people that I ultimately think have no exposure to it at all, or at the very least not aware of any exposure. In other words, heard a song, it went in one ear and out the other, and you forgot it. This is not necessarily for people who are already familiar with this stuff. This is not necessarily for people who are looking to dig deeper. This is for people that are complete and utter neophytes in the world of progressive rock, want to check it out, want to figure out whether or not it's something they're going to enjoy. And these are the ones I am selecting for their significance, for their accessibility, for their ease of entree, so to speak, for the uninitiated. If you're not used to progressive rock, it's a lot to digest at once. It is a lot to take in. There are a lot of things going on. It is often rather unusual in its composition or structure, time signature, things that are going to feel off to those who maybe are not familiar with it, if are used to more standard, more popular forms of music. So this is the beginning for the very beginners. And stick around to the end. I've got an extra special bonus track, so to speak, that I'm going to suggest as well for those that want to do it, but maybe want to do it from a different angle with the same bands. So this is where we're going to go. This is Dave's list of how to get into prog, the top 5 albums I would recommend it for new people in the world of prog. Starting off basically at the beginning, the Moody Blues, In Search of the Lost Chord. Now, this could have just as easily been the album before it, Days of Future Past, but the way I approached it was I liked the idea of accessibility. Both albums, especially the other one, are cited as kind of the starting point for progressive rock. These were the albums that kind of first brought it into popular culture, into the popular vernacular, that hit the charts and had hits. I suggest this one because I think it's a little easier to get into. It's not tied to an orchestra, or it's not the origin vehicle for some record company to promote their new recording process, which is kind of what Days of Future Past has as part of its origins, that the company wanted to promote their new recording process. They wanted to involve an orchestra. They asked the Moody Blues to be involved in it. And those two things are kind of inextricably linked. And I would say In Search of the Lost Chord is a little less unfettered by any additional expectations or motivations. And it features songs that aren't quite so conceptually linked, which allows them to, I think, be more easily digested individually. Songs like Ride My Seesaw and Legend of a Mind are great examples of psychedelic rock with progressive trappings and strong pop sensibilities. That's what makes them accessible. It gives them something, in some ways, maybe of a dated feel. They are definitely of their time. But they're also immediately, I think, comfortable because of that, and because of their links with 60s era pop, like the Beatles and the Kinks. Those things are evident of it in them as well. And I think all that makes this an easy place to start, and chronologically, it is a bit of a starting place. All of it comes down to basically a great album that is also a great entree into the genre. The next album is ultimately an utter no-brainer. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. And when I say no-brainer, I'm not kidding. This one is the one most likely to already being known by name and or title or the logo, the famous rainbow through the triangle prism, the light through the rainbow to the rainbow through the triangle prism. It makes sense when you see the photo, even if my mouth won't let me describe it right now. Even to the most uninitiated of prog listeners, somewhere along the line, they are familiar with the name, they're familiar with the title, and they're familiar with the logo, and there's a reason for that. This is the biggest selling prog album of all time, and one of the biggest selling albums of all time, period. And it's by a band that really only ever had 2 songs that could be considered hits. One of them was off this, the other one comes later. Cinematic, psychedelic in scope. This one is filled with memorable lyrics and musical ideas and melodies, and it just gives the entire album this easy feeling of familiarity, as well as bringing the listener some really cool philosophical concepts to consider at the same time if you're listening to the lyrics. There's a serious reason this one sat on the Billboard Top 200 Albums list for almost 20 years. This is as big as prog albums get, and honestly, it's about as big as rock albums get, period. It's accessible and down to earth, while at the same time being elevated rock music that set new standards for recording and engineering. This one really strikes a balance between the progressive and the popular, really like no other progressive rock album I can think of. Next was a little bit of a tough one to select, but hear me out. It's Yes, the Yes album. Now, I know some folks might be surprised by that a little bit that are familiar. They might be thinking, well, why not Fragile? Why not Close to the Edge? Well, I look at it this way. Again, accessibility to the uninitiated is, I think, one of my defining criteria for picking these albums. However, as an introduction, this album really shines. It features some of their best songs without overwhelming the listener with, with epic giant songs and musical oddities and other strange digressions that are parts of those next 2 albums. This one has some just wonderfully accessible and memorable melodies that are almost immediately catchy. Whether it's I've Seen All Good People or Yours Is No Disgrace, these are songs that really make an immediate impact on a new listener, while still providing a lot of that trademark Yes musical virtuosity and extended musical sections. Again, without overwhelming them with ridiculously long compositions. Now, a couple of them are pretty long, but compared to some of the things you would hear on Close to the Edge, not that terribly long. And there's really no chaff here. There are no strange little noodlings and things like that go on in Fragile. Every single song is a winner and very welcoming, and I think very inviting to the new listener. Really, honestly, if the person who comes away with an appreciation for this album, then you're ready for the higher level stuff that you're going to get on Fragile and Close to the Edge. And I expect you're prepared to enjoy those even more at that point. As again, with these recommendations, my thinking is to, help the prog newbie walk before they run a little bit. Next, Genesis, Trick of the Tail. Some of you might, Genesis fans, some of you big Genesis fans might cry foul for me picking this over something from the Peter Gabriel era albums. But hear me out. It's honestly not just because this would happen to be my favorite Genesis album. It's also, I think, the one that does the best job of balancing the firmly English pastoral progressive early albums with their quintessentially whimsical English flavors to them, with the latter day Phil Collins influenced, pop influenced later years. These songs honestly have all the whimsy intact, but it's backed up by impeccable musicianship that they've always displayed. And it's a little bit shorter compositions on average, a little bit more immediate, a little bit more of a pop sheen to them. You get some solid rockers like Dance on a Volcano and Squonk, mixed in with some lovely ballads like Entangled and Ripples, as well as, Genesis quirky stories like Robbery, Assault, and Battery, as well as the title track. There's honestly a bit of everything on this one, and it's in more easily digested chunks for the neophyte to absorb, again, without feeling overwhelmed by these expansive, extensive compositions. There's nothing like Supper's Ready on here that's going to run 22, 23 minutes. And honestly, for my money, this is quite possibly Phil Collins' finest vocal performance with the band on this album. And again, Phil Collins, Genesis, these are names people at least probably know, like Pink Floyd, although they may not know their music. From here, exploring the rest of the Genesis catalog, that's why this is a nice jumping off point, either forward or backwards. It's going to feel like a very natural progression because this one really links their very proggy side of life with their poppy future that's going to be coming down the road for them. Very cool stuff. It's very, very, very much one of their best regarded albums. Next, we have Rush, Farewell to Kings. This one was tough because, again, I had to think about what am I picking here? And, I could have easily chosen 2112. It's a better known in some ways, bigger seller, I think. And I could have chosen Hemispheres. Honestly, for me, I would say that Rush at their proggiest is not the easiest place to start for the newbie. I'll admit, their serious prog jams tend to be long, 10 to 18, and sometimes over 20 minutes. They can be intimidating to someone who's not used to songs like that, who are not used to sitting and paying attention to one song that long. If you're used to songs that are 3, maybe 5 minutes, it's a stretch. And musically, they can be very dense and almost experimental at times. However, knowing I would choose a Rush album, because, come on, it's me. And I'm always going to recommend some Rush. I went with this one. Overall, I think the songs are a bit more melodic and accessible. They're a bit more standard in their compositional forms compared to the other two, especially when you look at classics like Closer to the Heart, and even Xanadu. Even though it's an extended composition, it's a melody that I think isn't overly odd or challenging. I think it's one that is easy to latch onto. The others, honestly, are other. You got Tuneful Rockers, and there's a ballad on there. In the end, only Cygnus X1, I think, has the potential to scare off the new listener a little bit. I won't deny that. But I would say if the album is listened to in track order, with that one, of course, being the final song on the album, if you made it that far, you're probably going to be okay with it. You're probably going to be fine because the other songs prepare you quite well for that. So, yeah, 2112 has the classic title suite. That's 22, 23 minutes, whatever. And then the side 2 has nothing to do with it, but it's got really great songs. Those are a little bit easier to access. 2112 is a challenging song. It's a 7-part suite, or 7-suite. Yeah, whatever. 7-part suite of songs. Words. And it's changes it up, and it's very almost theatrical or cinematic in its approach. And with Hemispheres, you start off with the title track, and that's a bit of a mind blower. That's the kind of thing that might prevent people from getting to the rest of the album, even though you've got La Villa Strangiato. That's a great, great, wonderful song, and it's an instrumental. If you're not used to listening to a lot of instrumentals, that extended jam might throw you off a little bit. So that's where I went with Farewell to Kings out of my options here. All right, now, extra credit. You get through these 5 albums and you want to keep exploring the classic era, this is where you go. So it's basically a bonus option, but if you get through those 5 and you go, I don't know, this is for me, blow this one off. If you get to the point where you go, I'm liking this, I want to go further, here's where you go. King Crimson, In the Court of the Crimson King. If you make it through all those other core 5 recommendations, you're going to want to check this one out. This one opens up with hard rocking, almost proto progressive metal punch in the face that is 20th century Schizoid Man. This is one of the quintessential classic era progressive rock albums. In fact, there are many that are going to argue that this is really truly the original true prog album. And I have no counter argument for that statement. I think I would largely have to agree with them. Complex, adventurous, grandiose, and all self-produced by a band that wouldn't be constrained by any record company limits or demands or bull. They wanted to do this their way. They had a producer lined up. They started working. It was, nope, this isn't going to happen. We are going to take this our own way, and the record company let them. The rest is history. This is, frankly, easily one of the greatest prog albums of all time. Top 10 minimum, top 5 probably. A lot of people would put it at number 1. It's perhaps slightly less accessible than the others because of how broad in scope it is and how complex and layered it is. But your mileage may vary. You may disagree, you may not. In the end, it is absolutely worth the listen, though. I'd highly recommend it. All right, so here we go. I promised you a bonus. I promised you a little extra content at the end. I'm calling this extra credit. And what this is if you want to approach prog from the 80s door with these same bands, mostly, and you want to do it essentially the way I did it, discovering these bands with the new music that came out in the 80s and then going backwards. That's all cool. If you want to do it that way, knock yourself out. It's absolutely one of those fun things to do, and you get a little perspective of what it was being back at that time. This is especially, for the most part, early 80s, first half of the 80s. And what I did was I picked an alternate album for each of the bands I just named, with one exception, and we'll get to that in a moment. And I'm going to give them to you here in pretty much the same order I gave them to you for the original 5, mostly. Starting off, Pink Floyd, The Wall. Now, immediately, some of you are saying, Dave, you may be already violating your self-set limit of the 80s. Again, my list, my rules. I can do what I want. And at the same time, I'm going to say this album makes a better option than their 2 albums that came out in the 80s. The first being The Final Cut, which is an apropos title considering the 999 other cuts committed by Roger Waters with his drive towards the end of the band and him leaving the band and essentially ending them with death by 1,000 cuts. This was the final cut. Not especially well regarded. Just not a great album. There are a lot of people that like it. There are some people that support it, but it's not that great. And then there's Momentary Lapse of Reason, which I feel comes kind of late in the decade and can be kind of divisive because Roger Waters was not involved. And it's not exactly Floyd, but for a lot of people, it's also a great album, at least are really well enjoyed. This album, The Wall, was released just 1 month prior to 1980, so it's not that far out of the 80s. And it's essentially the other biggest album that Pink Floyd had. It's a bit dense, and it's very expansive. There are some moments that feel a bit like filler, and it can be oppressively dark at times, but also some of the greatest songs Pink Floyd ever created, and possibly the greatest guitar solo ever recorded on Comfortably Numb. Well worth it. Next, Yes, 90125. This was Yes completely reinventing themselves, somewhat accidentally, actually, because this was not originally supposed to be a Yes album. It was a band that was going to be called Cinema, and it was formed around the guitar work and writing of Trevor Rabin, but because it also included other members of Yes, which was essentially broken up at the time, and then John Anderson, the lead singer of Yes during all their classic years, joined the band. They said, you know what, screw it. We're going to call ourselves Yes, and we'll name one of the songs Cinema. So really, it's some parts, it's modern synth, new wave pop. Other parts, it's kind of almost classic Yes with a modern update and a modern sheen. but there's no fat on this album, and it's just a wonderful collection of songs, even if you aren't necessarily a Yes fan. Next, we have Genesis, Abacab. Now, I'm going to admit this one can be divisive for some at times. Shout out to Phil out there, not Collins. You know who you are, Phil. As this was Genesis, and their trip progressing further away from their prog roots and getting a little closer to the pop stuff that was largely led by Phil Collins. But for me, and for a lot of people, this was the best of their 80s output, featuring a lot of songs that were classic to me, like the title track and No Reply at All, but also some quintessentially whimsical prog treats, that Genesis was known for, like Me and Sarah Jane. And I always think of Doctor Who when I hear that song. And Dodo/Lurker. For me, this was part of my intro, a main part of my intro to Genesis, and formed the starting point of my love for their music. Well worth it. Next, we have another tough choice, Rush, Signals. Just as easily, you could probably start with Permanent Waves or Moving Pictures, the two albums prior to this. And frankly, they're all great starting points. They just really are. I'm picking this one because it was my first Rush album, so it was my jumping on point. And for me also, I think it represents a great pivot point, similar to the way that Trick of the Tail does for Genesis. This represents a point in Rush when they were in transition. It was their first foray into putting synths front and center, synths and keyboards, and moving the guitars back a little bit, while also the album still contains a lot of nice selections of power trio jamming, really impressive rockin' stuff. And it was a big change up for them. So, they got the epic ode to teen angst that is Subdivisions. And with that, you've got a true touchstone of the era. And while I'm talking about that, why do we have a bunch of D&D playing nerds and Stranger Things, and I have yet to hear any Rush music playing in the background? Come on, folks. I was there. I was playing D&D. I was playing D&D. I know of what I speak. Just saying. Anyway, from there, it's very easy to drift back into Rush's earlier days, with less synths, more guitars, harder rocking, or move forward if you want and get into their more synth heavy and their polished stuff that came in the latter years. It worked for me, to be perfectly honest. It worked quite well for me. I jumped on right at the right time. And next we would have King Crimson, Discipline. Never a huge hit, this album. I did pretty well, but it wasn't huge. But like a lot of these bands I've just been talking about who were evolving and adapting for the 80s, this is a band truly reinventing themselves entirely. As opposed to evolving, which was a slow, this was, for all intents and purposes, a new band. Robert Fripp, the leader, basically put a new band together, although admittedly it was the same drummer, Bill Bruford, with them, but new bass player, new guitarist and vocalist, and an entirely different sound than you would hear from In the Court of the Crimson King. You would be almost shocked that it's the same band. That's how different it is. So, they even almost like, it's almost like they changed up their defining influences and traits. They went from this classical and proggy and jazz influenced sound to now all of a sudden reflecting modern day art rock and new wave and stuff like that, as influenced by, say, like the Talking Heads and other such stuff. And it was a completely different band. It's complex, poppy at times, definitely avant-garde, nothing they had done before. So definitely to check it out. So the extra credit this time around, you'll notice that King Crimson was not the extra credit, but was in fact part of the core five. The extra credit comes about this way because honestly, I had no firm suggestion for an 80s era moody blues album to recommend. They had 4 albums during that time period, but they were kind of uneven. They possessed some wonderful songs, some of the best songs the Moodies ever put together, but as a whole, I just didn't feel that any of the albums were strong enough to really recommend as something that go, here's an example to get you into prog. Just didn't feel that way. And it's a shame. You can almost pick their 20th Century Masters collection and listen to the last 5 or 6 tracks, and you would get an idea of the great stuff they did in the 80s, but it's not an album. So I had to come up with something different. I needed to skip them and find something else to basically put in their place. And what I did was pick an album that pulls together a number of the artists we've already talked about. And that would be Asia with their self-titled debut. This one features former members of King Crimson and Yes, plus other prog rock greats. This really was a prog rock supergroup that somehow took the world by storm with the debut. It's mostly melodic hard rock with strong pop sheens. The prog roots are still on display with complex arrangements and playing and extended instrumental sections and all that. At the same time with these strong, catchy vocals and choruses that just were great for sing-along. For most people, no, this was completely an unexpected turn from this supergroup that people were expected were going to be churning out these amazing prog rock compositions and such. But the public loved it while the critics dumped on it. Oh, well, top album in 1982. I don't think the guys in Asia cared that much. Again, the idea of prog artists reinventing themselves in the 80s, and this is absolutely a prime example of that. Just 4 guys coming together who were part of some of the greatest bands ever, and they did something entirely different and unexpected. They zigged when the world thought they were going to zag, and it kind of worked for them for a while. Anyway, that's where I say you start, if you want to start getting into progressive rock, if you want to start with the classic era, which I think is a great era to start with because it is the foundation for everything, those are the albums I recommend. If you kind of want to do a backdoor 80s thing and find your way maybe to the classic era with 80s albums by the classic bands, do that. Have fun with it. Whatever blows your skirt up. It's all cool with me. Okay, and that's my list. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you find something you like from that, and maybe it gets you into the prog and get you started down the hole to becoming a prog noggin, a full-fledged card-carrying prog noggin like the rest of us, right? So, if you like what I'm doing, if you're enjoying the channel, please hit the like and subscribe. Hit the bell if you want to get the notifications when I upload new stuff. Also, my links for social media are in the description, as well as the link for The Expanse, my Live 365 station, playing nothing but 24/7 progressive rock and metal. And on Sundays, it's the Brain Salad Sunday, where it's all prog rock from the 60s and 70s. A lot of what we just talked about here, all the classics. And finally, if you want to check out my back catalog of interviews, go search Bleeding Edge Interviews wherever you get podcasts, and you can listen to all those old ones. Keep an eye out for the new ones coming up. I'm always getting to talk to new prog artists all the time. Love it. So, for now, that's all I've got. Don't be afraid to deviate from the norm. Keep it proggy. This is Super Dave, signing off.